Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm very honored to address you this evening and grateful for your hospitality. I sort of think of myself as a distant cousin visiting from out of town. That is, I am addressing you partly because of my role as an Oblate of St. Benedict, associated with St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, of the much colder and more northern climates. Dropping in upon you all as my Mazenodian, not Macedonian, aunts, uncles, and cousins who are living down here in the warmth and heat, not only of a more southerly climate, but of the political and social tensions in this borderland. Although I can't claim a broad familiarity with the Mazenodian charism, I did visit the mission at La Morita in Tijuana in 2005 with my good friend Victor Carmona, a former faculty member here at the Oblate School of Theology. We were both young, naive, wide-eyed graduate students at the time. I also happened in that same meeting to meet Astrid Roldan, who was there with her high school students, who went on to marry Victor, though I can claim no credit for getting them together. We have remained very close, however. We are godparents to each other's children. So that's my brief familiarity, other than the research I did to prepare for this talk with the Mazenodian family. In their planning document titled A Path Towards Communion 2017 to 2020, the International Union of Superiors General envisioned the following. Quote, a path which involves becoming conscious of opening out from the local community to that of the order or the institute, from consciousness of the order, institute, society, or association to that of the charismatic family, and finally, from the charismatic family to communion with all of the charisms of the church. End quote. So your invitation for me to engage in dialogue with you all around this Mazenodian Family Vocation Congress is already an act toward embodying this communion with all of the charisms of the church. In his email describing the nature of tonight's event, David Munoz wrote, quote, previously we worked out of a model whereby the Oblates were at the center and those associated with us, mostly laity, shared in the Oblate charism. Our research has encouraged us to move away from that model to place the spirituality of Saint Eugene de Mazenod at the center, with the Oblates as one of the 8 expressions of the Mazenodian charism. End quote. This strikes me as a particularly wise approach, and it is my hope that our dialogue here this evening will open out, that out of our dialogue here this evening, this will open out towards exploring not just a Benedictine Mazenodian charismatic communion, but from there that it might provide some clues towards a model upon which we can put to work in service of building a broader charismatic communion among the universal church. So my goal this evening is to think theologically in helping us move toward an answer to a question posed by Father Frank Santucci in his YouTube video that I watched in preparation for tonight, where he asked the question, what is the vocation of a layperson in a charism that has come through a religious congregation? So to move towards answering that question, I'll begin tonight with a brief story of how I came to embrace my particular vocation as an Oblate of St. Benedict. Then I'll move into providing a brief historical overview of oblates and practices of oblation in the Western Church. And I should note that there's probably interesting things that could be learned from the Eastern churches, but that was outside the scope of my, both my competence and the time I had to prepare for this lecture. I take it as a starting point that to be an oblate means something specific enough that we can speak of oblation in a matter that is general enough to be applicable to anyone who would fall under the broad umbrella of ecclesial identities that we might call oblates, and yet specific enough to be found meaningful for the particular family charism to which oblates dedicate themselves and to which you all dedicate yourselves. As I do this historical overview, I'll also highlight some general trends in the theology and practices of ministry, tethering these accounts to a developing theology of oblation. I will then pause for a bit of time for discussion and questions, and as the introduction mentioned, we'll take a short break. In the second half, then I wish to explore the growing edge of what it means to be an oblate in the church today, in light of post-conciliar trends in theologies of ministry. And by post-conciliar, I don't want to, if I start using too technical of language and I'm losing you, please throw a hand up or something. But by post-conciliar, I mean since Vatican II in 1965, ending then. I will suggest, hopefully somewhat provocatively, that the lived experiences of oblates today makes oblates both iconoclasts and trailblazers. First, oblates are iconoclasts insofar as oblates contribute to the process of challenging a historical binary between lay and ordained forms of ministry. It seems to me, and I'll articulate this as I go, that this binary is not serving the institutional church as well as it once had, but it has also proven particularly difficult to leave behind, both in theology and in practice. Second, oblates are trailblazers in emerging models of ministry by embodying what I think of as emergent forms of leadership in the universal church. And that's why the subtitle of my talk, with an unfortunately long title, is Toward a Theology of the Oblate Charism, Vocation, and Ministry. What I offer here today is not what I would consider a kind of neatly packaged systematic theology of oblation, but rather hopefully an interesting stopping point in what I take to be a rapidly evolving form of ecclesial leadership, one for which we do not yet have an adequate theological account or lexicon. So my more modest goal for this evening is to lay out the historical, the theological, and the practical contours of what such a theology of the oblate charism, vocation, and ministry entails, and then to gesture toward what this might mean for the universal communion of all the baptized envisioned by the superiors general. So that's kind of the outline for our evening together. So let me start with a brief story about my own path towards oblation as a Benedictine. I chose Jesus' words from Matthew 12:50 as the title of tonight's presentation. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus' use of family kinship to describe those who do God's will provides a fitting connection to our theological exploration of what unites the full spectrum of oblate family charisms in the church. Matthew 12:50 also highlights something that is at the core of the oblate experience. Becoming an oblate is a response to a call, to a very personal revelation of the will of the Father, to use Jesus' words. For the oblate, the divine will has become focused or specified through a particular family charism, or through encounter with a family charism, a gift offered initially to a founder or founders of that charism, and embodied historically within a religious order, institute, or society. My road to becoming an oblate of St. Benedict is indelibly marked by a snowy January in the year 2000, which was my senior year of undergraduate studies at St. John's University. So if you have experience with Minnesota winters, you know what this is like. My roommates were all traveling out of the country for the month, leaving me to my singular and rather nerdy purpose, which was to read Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous Russian novel, The Brothers Karamazov. That is, when I wasn't cross-country skiing or playing darts at the pub in the evening. So at this point in my life, early 20s, I admit to a kind of full-blown romanticization of monastic life, aided by my occasional wanderings into the Abbey Church for morning or evening prayers, and by the stories of Alyosha Karamazov. Alyosha is one of the three Karamazov brothers after which the novel is named. He's the young, naive hero of Dostoevsky's tale of faith and doubt in 19th century Russia. The brothers Karamazov, or as my nerdy intellectual friends and I like to call it, the brothers K, falls within the Russian literary tradition of the holy fool. The holy fool is the unlikely hero, a simple but genuinely good person who holds on to faith in spite of the world's temptations to a sort of amoral hedonism represented in the novel by the scoundrel brother Dmitry Karamazov, or to a kind of hard-nosed intellectual cynicism represented by the more intellectual brother Ivan Karamazov. Side note, the book is about this big. It's long. If you don't want to or don't have the time to read the whole thing, the dialogue between Alyosha and the intellectual brother Ivan is one of my favorite pieces in all of literature that I've ever read. Alyosha, the holy fool, is a young novice in the monastery of the town where Dostoevsky chose to set his novel. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of this town, though it is said that it's modeled after Staraya, Russia, where he wrote the novel. Toward the end of the novel, Alyosha is informed by his spiritual elder, the kind and wise Father Zosima, that his vocation will in fact not be to the monastery, but to a life of faith in the world, dedication to family and simple labor. So Father Zosima says to Alyosha, "You will go forth from these walls, but you will sojourn in the world like a monk." Now, little did I know at that tender age of 21 that in a couple of years I would spend a short period as a candidate at St. John's Abbey. So candidacy is the pre-novitiate. Convinced, just as Alyosha was, that my vocation was to the monastic life, only to discover after 3 short months that this was not, in fact, going to be my vocation. As they say, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. The kind of sort of breakdown that it took to get me to break out of that paradigm is for another story. Paradoxically, however, this discernment was not really a rejection of monastic life on my part, but rather a clear embrace of a call to marriage and family life, although it would still be several years before I met my now wife. So soon after leaving candidacy, I began the year-long process of study and reflection upon the rule of St. Benedict that was required in order to become an Oblate of St. Benedict. I made, so it's a process, you're given a series of questions and essays that you write, reflecting on different parts of the rule, the vows that you take, and then how are you going to live those out outside of the monastery. I made my final oblation on January 4th, 2005, in one of the small chapels in the crypt below the main Abbey Church at St. John's, in the presence of the Oblate director and another monk as a witness. If you have had a chance to visit the Abbey Church, it's a striking piece of architecture. The crypt below was built in the 60s, right as Vatican II was starting, and it's full of these beautiful chapels that are all for the private masses that were then eradicated after Vatican II. But it's still a beautiful sacred space. This was a small but highly symbolic gesture of my desire and commitment to somehow sojourn in the world like a monk. Although life has become much more complex than those snowy days in January, and attempts to balance commitments to marriage, to family with 3 young children, and career, there is still this small part of myself that fancies myself a simple monk, a holy fool in a bewilderingly complex world. Admittedly, that image is rather simplistic and overly romanticized. I'm the hero of the story. Nonetheless, the Benedictine Oblate vows to stability, obedience, and the notoriously difficult to translate Latin phrase conversatio morum. These are the 3 vows that Benedictines take. Conversatio morum is most frequently translated as, today at least, fidelity to the monastic way of life, and it implies a lifelong, ongoing process of conversion. So interesting how one vow is to stability and the other vow is to never hold still and continue to be open to the conversion of the Spirit. So these vows, taken as an oblate, have consistently provided me with a focal point, a thread of continuity amid the complexities of adult life, of constant change, and the inevitable moments of uncertainty that come with being an adult. They have also provided me with a sense of order along the meandering path of a professional career in theology and in healthcare that is both a vocation and a ministry. I would imagine that most of you in this room could probably tell a similar story of how encounters with Oblates, Mazenodian spirituality, and perhaps for some of you, public commitments to those ideals or vows have provided a sense of focus and order to the vagaries of life, even as the specific details will likely vary from person to person. So much for my own finding my way into a particular Benedictine family charism as an oblate. So now I want to move to talk about oblates or oblation in the life and ministry of the church, provide a historical overview. From a purely historical perspective, oblation as a distinct ecclesial reality seems to have emerged in the Western Church very early within the Cenobitic monastic movement. So by Cenobitic, that refers to the communal monasticism. Early on in the Rule, St. Benedict says, he outlines the different kinds of monks, and he says that the gyrovags, the ones who just go from monastery to monastery and never stay put, they're the worst, don't trust them. And then Cenobitic, communal, is the ideal because most of us need the accountability of living in community. And recall, if you're familiar with your history, the background here is the ideal of Anthony the Hermit in Egypt and the Egyptian monks who were hermits. So interestingly, Benedict places an emphasis on Cenobitic community monasticism, and he says, only those who have been tested in community for a long period of time are ever going to be fit for the hermitage. Actually played out in interesting ways in the life of Thomas Merton, who wanted to be a monk for a very long time until his abbot eventually let him do so. So oblation emerged early within the Cenobitic monastic movement that became institutionalized in the 6th century under the rule of St. Benedict and the subsequent patronage of Pope Gregory the Great, who was himself also a Benedictine. St. Benedict himself does not use the term oblate or oblation in his rule. Instead, he prefers to use variants of the Latin verb offero, or offering. Even though he doesn't use the term directly, he does dedicate chapter 59 of the rule to, quote, the sons and nobles of the poor who are offered to the monastery, end quote. With characteristic brevity, Benedict outlines the contractual terms under which such offerings are to be received. This was definitely a political exchange. And then he adds, quoting from the rule. And in this way, let everything be barred, so that the boy may have no expectations. So the main thing that's been barred is whether or not he can receive gifts or money from his parents outside the monastery. Whereby, which God forbid, he might be deceived and ruined, as we have learned by experience. End quote. So this final line, as we have learned by experience, indicates that this practice of offering one's sons and possibly daughters, though we don't have direct evidence of that, in the women's communities founded by St. Scholastica, Benedict's sister. This offering existed from the earliest days of Cenobitic monasticism. In its initial form, the purpose of child oblation was intended, by the parents at least, we don't know how much say the child had in this, it was intended for the child to remain in the monastery, eventually moving into permanent monastic vows as an adult. And if you put yourself in the mind frame of medieval culture, this would not be all that different from an arranged marriage, insofar as a carefully chosen relationship for a child could lead to significant advancement for the social standing of the entire family. Interesting side note to history here. This was clearly the intention, for example, of the family of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, whose parents initially offered him as a child oblate at the famous and politically powerful monastery of Monte Cassino, which Benedict himself had founded several centuries earlier, with the hopes that the young Thomas might one day become abbot and leverage his political influence in favor of his family. If you know Aquinas' story, Thomas himself had to endure kidnapping and detention in his family's castle tower, and temptation by a prostitute sent from his brothers in order to leave the monastery and fulfill his desire to join the new order of preachers as a Dominican. They were not happy about this. He eventually won, which I guess, his stubbornness paid off in many ways for the church. Gervais Holdaway, a Benedictine, OSB, notes that in practice, quote, some children apparently were educated in a monastery or elsewhere by monastic tutors, but did not remain in religious life. They were a temporary offering to be formed in their intellectual and spiritual life before taking their place as adults in the world. Again, an interesting side note, I've heard in some of my studies in interreligious dialogue that this practice is more common in some Buddhist monasteries of temporary vows and formation as a young person before going off then and bringing those values into one's profession and career. It's often thought that didn't happen in Christian monasticism, but there is some evidence that it did. Two prominent examples of temporary oblation from the first millennium of Christian history include the Emperor Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious in the 8th and 9th centuries. Although in my research I haven't been able to identify a precise origin or date for using the term oblate in my research, it is likely that term oblate was applied to both permanent and temporary child offerings well in advance of the first known treatise on the practice, which is a small work titled On the Oblation of Children, written by a Benedictine monk, Rabanus Maurus, in the 9th century. So it's a well-established practice, though it looks very different than what we think of today. By the 11th century, another Benedictine monk, William of Hirsau, established two different rules for two distinct types of oblates, presumably based upon the rule of St. Benedict itself. So he established one for what he called the regular oblates. He also called them interns, who lived in the monastery without taking formal vows. There's a similar practice today called claustral oblation. It's a mouthful, but it basically is for oblates who are not in full religious vows, but who actually will live and participate in the life of the monastery. And another set of rules that he wrote for what he called secular oblates, those who lived outside the monastery but were affiliated with it or associated. The motivations for this secular oblation were varied, and of course we don't know entirely why people did this, but they may have ranged from a general desire for a kind of spiritual connection or association with a particular monastery, which is similar to my own experience. Could also be an indication of patronage towards the monastery. So a wealthy patron who supports the life of the monastery might become more officially affiliated as an oblate. Or conversely, there may have been a certain amount of economic dependency of some oblates who were sort of dependent on earning their livelihood through employment at the monastery, and then would have sort of been drawn into spiritual association as well. So Benedictine oblation continued to find new forms of expression throughout the Middle Ages. For example, in the 14th century, the Olivetans, who were founded by Bernard Ptolemy, and who also follow the rule of Saint Benedict in their common life, established their own brotherhood of oblates, though we don't have much evidence for what they did. Frances of Rome, who died in the year 1440, deserves special recognition for her innovative oblate service. Interestingly, we named my middle daughter Frances before I even knew who Frances of Rome was, and then came to find out that Saint Francis, the female Saint Francis, was in fact an oblate. That kind of was one of those surprising moments of serendipity, or the Holy Spirit. She's revered as a special patroness of oblates. Frances was a wife and a mother who was affiliated as an oblate of a local Olivetan monastery, while she also organized a group of women in prayer and in service to the poor in Rome, in the Eternal City. As oblation developed, the practice of child oblation, whether temporary or permanent, was gradually abandoned, sometimes by direct decree, or it just fell out of practice. So new forms emerged while the original practice sort of fell away, which I think is very fitting for the conversation that you all are engaged in here as well. It's also worth pausing here to note that Benedictine monasticism itself holds a distinctive place in the medieval period of the Church, in the millennium from approximately the 5th to the 16th centuries. Two of the most important medieval ecclesial reformers, Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century and Pope Gregory the 7th in the 11th century, were both first monks who later became bishops, and who based their reforms of the ordained clergy and of the church on monastic ideals. Most notably, of course, if you're familiar with this history, is the canonical requirement for monastic celibacy required for all ordained priests under Gregory the 7th. So these trends have left indelible marks upon what we think of as universal practices of ordination, of ministry, and monastic ideals in the church. It is also worth recalling, however, that these are distinctively medieval and Western forms of ministry and canon law practice. And I should emphasize, I'm sort of referencing the canonical side of things here, but I am not a canon lawyer. My training is in moral theology. If one looks at the biblical and earliest church accounts of ministry, for example, one finds a wide diversity of ministries determined not by special social class or status, but by functions or services. The Greek word here is diakonia, services that arose out of necessity within the worshiping community. That Greek word diakonia in non-ecclesial usage could just refer to someone who served at the table as a servant in a home. In his letter to the Philippians, for example, St. Paul addresses the episkopoi, the overseers, the presbyteros, the elders, and the diakonia, the ones who serve, using these three terms to describe ministerial functions in the churches to which he's writing in Antioch, Jerusalem, and Ephesus. Only a few centuries later, we find these terms serving as a biblical basis for a solidification of the canonical and hierarchical threefold roles of bishop, priest, and deacon. So again, these are rooted in original Greek terms, episkopoi as meaning overseer, that is the bishop, the presbyteros, which literally means elder, becomes the priest, and the diaconia becomes the ones who serve become the deacon. So after Constantine's legalization of Christianity in 313, the Western Church naturally turned and started using the resources found in Latin and Roman culture. And the Roman ideal entails a sort of preference for fine distinctions, order, and well-defined public offices. Thomas O'Meara, a Dominican theologian, writes that one consequence of these ecclesial developments in the first centuries of the church is that, quote, after the 3rd century, we have stasis and reduction, and after the 6th century, diminution. Ministry has fewer forms or is institutionalized. Ministry becomes synonymous with priesthood and is grafted onto canonical position, end quote. In this kind of emerging social and religious order, quoting here again from O'Meara, the clergy were constituted as a separate social class endowed with religious and civic privileges, end quote. The supreme ideal here was the priest, monk, bishop, like the 2 Pope Gregories that I noted above, who integrated the highest internal ideals of monastic contemplation and prayer with the Roman ideals of governance, hierarchy, and order. All this developed into a highly static distinction between laity and ordained clergy, wherein the ideal of ministry is the ordained priest, while other forms of ministry were seen as diminutions of the priestly clerical ideal. To go back to the importance of language, the Latin term laicus, from which the English term laity is derived, is also derived from the Greek word for the people. The Greek word is laos. As distinct in its biblical usage from the more Hebrew word goyim, that is the nations. So the laos were the people called by God, and the goyim were the Gentiles, the nations. In this sort of 2-class system that emerges, laity comes to take on an additional connotation of ordinary, outside, not holy, and even profane. This is an unfortunate twist of history that the Greek term laos, from which our term laity is derived, initially referred to the people of God who were called and chosen by God as distinct from what the Jews referred to as the goyim, the Gentiles, or the nations. So in practice, it has come to be identified with a kind of secondary inferior status in the church. I'll return to the significance of this terminology and this dualism between priesthood and laity in the second part of tonight's presentation. From a canonical perspective, this laity-clergy duality has prevented, and here I struggle with language, baptized but not ordained members of the church from holding leadership offices entrusted with real canonical or governing authority. In this context, which to a significant extent remains with us in the church today, oblation was one of several expressions of the Spirit's ongoing call of all the baptized to exercise ministerial leadership in a diversity of forms of expression. For example, in every age in which clericalism has reached heights of emphasis, the Holy Spirit seems to also work just as hard to seek a fuller expression in broader forms of ministry. So again, history can be illuminative here for the kinds of questions that you all are asking at this Congress. In the 12th century, for example, prior to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which banned the establishment of new religious orders temporarily, there arose movements such as the Pauperes Christi, the poor of Christ, who lived in urban centers in Europe and served the poor. The Cathars, or the Albigensians, who were a more heretical movement, and other movements of preaching and service. These eventually coalesced into what was then the new mendicant orders initiated by Saints Francis and Dominic in the Franciscans and Dominicans. Interestingly, one condition of canonical recognition for the Franciscans and the Dominicans and their followers was their acceptance of tonsure, which was a physical sign of adopting a clerical status, even as their founding ideals were motivated by Christ's poverty and a rejection of social status. So that's one example of the Spirit seeking new forms of ministry expression. The Reformation, of course, spurred renewed attention to diverse forms of ministry. And although Protestant thought on the whole seeks to emphasize the priesthood of all believers, something also reaffirmed at Vatican II, Reformation theologies still tend to place a special emphasis on the distinctive leadership of the pastor and ordained ministry. Another example from the 1800s is explosions of spiritual and ministerial renewal expressed in a rapid growth of apostolic religious orders for both men and women, of which, as you all know better than I, St. Eugene de Mazenod's establishment of the missionary Oblates of the Most Holy and Immaculate Virgin Mary, to cite the full title approved by Leo XII, is a notable example. We can also note in passing other significant movements toward broader expressions of ministry, such as the social organizations of Action Française and Catholic Action in the 19th century, a kind of lay-led form of social engagement that it was not always clear how it fit within the actual life of the church. And in more recent times, we can note movements like the Catholic Worker Movement, the Community of Sant'Egidio, Communion and Liberation, or even the increase in professional ministries for theologians, pastoral associates in parishes or missions or dioceses, or mission leaders in Catholic healthcare organizations, where I currently work with many of them in my current position. All of these can be seen as a natural response by baptized persons to a call or a vocation from the Holy Spirit, who provides leaders with a charism. Recalling charism means gift. That is, a gift to oversee these forms of ministry, even if their canonical roles are not fully integrated into a canonical status that we have yet figured out how to recognize. So in every age, the Spirit always seems to work to express a full diversity of ministries required by the church and the people of God, the laos, to use the Greek term. So to return briefly to the Benedictine movement of oblation, that tradition is also marked by some distinctively American innovations in the last 2 centuries. Boniface Wimmer of St. Vincent's Arch Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, envisioned a kind of third order of St. Benedict, similar to like the third order Franciscans and Dominicans, that would be open to both men and women. In 1865, Wimmer approved a certificate for the Institute of the Secular Oblates of the Benedictine Order. The first manual for Benedictine Oblates was published at St. Vincent's in 1898, and another manual for Oblates emerged from St. John's Abbey in 1937. Abbot Alcuin Deutsch of St. John's Abbey wrote that this manual was prepared at the direct request of the abbot primate of the Benedictine Confederation located in Rome. So in the Benedictine world, each monastery maintains its own autonomy, but there is a confederation who are sort of organized under an abbot primate in Rome. There's also a brief from Pope Leo XIII in 1898, granting spiritual favors and privileges to Benedict and Oblates, and a decree from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops and Regulars, approving a set of statutes and rules for secular Oblates of St. Benedict. So, by looking at this history, we can see that the vocation of the Oblate has offered significant gifts to both the church and to society, of which I'll mention just a few more. Elena Piscopia is the first woman to receive a university degree as a doctor of philosophy in Padua in the year 1678. She was an Oblate. Thomas More and Oliver Plunkett, both Catholic martyrs of the English Reformation, were Oblates. Jacques and Raisa Maritain, a married couple who were prominent Catholic philosophers in the 20th century, whose work contributed both to the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948 and to the development of Catholic social thought, both Oblates, and Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. One could also consider the immense impact that the monastic life and writings of Thomas Merton had on many persons working to serve the gospel, even if many of them were not formally Oblates. It was a way of extending that charism to many people. So at this point, I think we can start to delineate the contours of a theology of an Oblate vocation, charism, and ministry. And I'll turn to two scriptural sources and the thought of Saint Eugene de Mazenod himself to ground this initial articulation. Several writers who have commented on oblation over the centuries have been drawn to Hannah's offering of her son Samuel to the service of God in the temple in the first chapter of the first book of Samuel as a kind of model of oblation. And of course, especially the early forms of child oblation, you can see the connection. Hannah's offering of Samuel provided a fitting scriptural model of giving oneself in loving service to God and neighbor through commitment to a particular community and a way of life. Other commentators have referenced Psalm 141, an important psalm in monastic prayer and in the divine office. The translation that I'll quote of Psalm 141, it comes from the 2010 Revised Grail Psalter, which is published by Conception Abbey in Missouri, reads as follows: "I have called you, O Lord, hasten to help me. Hear my voice when I cry to you. Let my prayer be accepted as incense before you, the raising of my hands like an evening oblation." In monastic and other liturgies, this oblation psalm is often paired with the lighting and offering of incense, adding a lovely kinesthetic touch to praying and chanting this psalm of oblation while watching the smoke swirling and ascending to God and smelling the sweet incense. And it's here within the total offering of oneself to God through commitment to a particular place, to a community of people, to an ordered way of life, that I think we can identify what is at the core of oblation, one with which Benedictines, Mazenodians, and any of the other 83 families of Oblates throughout the world can identify. I got that number 83 from Father Frank Santucci's talk, so I hope it's right. Sounds right. Eugene de Mazenod used the term oblate to refer to the members of his congregation from their very first profession of vows in 1816, even preceding the use of the term within the official title of the institute that was later conferred upon Eugene and his followers by Pope Leo XII, first as the Oblates of St. Charles in 1825, and then as the longer version, the Missionary Oblates of the Most Holy and Immaculate Virgin Mary in 1826. Writing in his journal on the day of those first vows, among his fellow followers and congregation, In 1816, de Mazenod writes the following, quote, "We prayed to the Divine Master that if it was his holy will to bless our undertaking, we would lead our present companions as well as those who would be associated with us in the future," here you are, "to appreciate the full value of the oblation of one's entire self to God, wanting to serve him unreservedly and consecrate one's life to the spread of his holy gospel and the conversion of souls. Our petitions were answered," end quote. And we could maybe put an explanation point after our petitions were answered, seeing a room full of Oblates and associates here this evening. Alfred Hubenning, hope I'm saying that right, OMI, writes that de Mazenod was influenced by St. Alphonsus of Liguori's use of the term oblation, or oblazione in Italian, to refer to the taking of vows, and by the French Cardinal Beruel's frequent use of the term in his short study on piety, which also influenced de Mazenod. Hubenning writes that, quote, "Oblate means total dedication to God, like the apostles, like Jesus, and with Jesus." And Emilien Lamirande, OMI, describes oblation, this is one of my favorite quotes, as, quote, "a kind of reckless and unreserved giving of ourselves to the glory and service of God, to the ministry, and to his infinite love and mercy." Reckless and unreserved. The distinctive Mazenodian charism highlights a particular dimension of oblation that includes a singular focus on a missionary zeal for serving the poor, the abandoned, and the marginalized. This dimension of oblation was always, one could argue, sort of latent in the Oblate charism, even in the Benedictine forms that I mentioned before, as witnessed by the charitable works and ministry of some of those examples, like Francis of Rome, the Maritanes, and Dorothy Day. But the Mazenodian Oblate charism is one that is lived out not so much by Benedictine vow of stability to place, but rather by a radical commitment expressed in the Oblate motto, Evangelizare pauperibus misit me, he sent me to evangelize the poor. This same spiritual charism is echoed in de Mazenod's insistence to, quote, "let us go by preference to the most abandoned places," and the bold desire to leave nothing undared for the gospel. So why, one might ask, have oblates in particular been called to the margins, to serve the abandoned of society, or to speak and act prophetically in the pursuit of justice? Of course, the simple answer is because that's what Jesus and the apostles did. And this is true. I think our study so far this evening also reveals another very important facet of the vocation and charism of oblation. Oblates, it seems to me, embody an implicit need to root one's commitment to acts of charity and tireless work on behalf of justice in a contemplative tradition and a community. And I imagine that Father Rollheiser will have more to say about that tomorrow evening. A deeply contemplative life is sustainable only when it's rooted in robust traditions of spiritual practice transmitted through historical lineages. So religious orders have written rules or constitutions that offer order to the chaos of life and continuity through time. They offer guidance in both liturgical and personal forms of prayer, and yet they're flexible enough to adapt to new circumstances. Thus, it seems quite natural that those gathered here who receive a call to serve the church and to serve the poor would also be drawn toward the charisms that are offered through oblate association. In this way, oblation can provide a necessary grounding point of stillness within a contemplative tradition and a shared communal life amid the sometimes arduous task of following Jesus out to the margins. Therefore, we can conclude this first part of our study tonight by noting that oblation is a complete offering of oneself to God and to following in the apostolic work of Jesus and his earliest apostles. By doing so with a commitment to a particular community and tradition, or family charism, to use the language I still opened with, and to an ordered way of life that seeks to integrate contemplation and action. For those who receive a special calling, and by special, I don't necessarily mean to imply better, but rather more focused or more specific, to live out their baptismal vows with a certain degree of intensity, formal oblation to a family charism, such as Benedictines or Mazenodians or others, brings a certain kind of specificity and focus to one's vows, baptism and vows, that sustains one in the journey to live into that vocation. So to follow the pattern of the subtitle of tonight's presentation, vocation or calling comes first and might be experienced first in a rather general sense of a desire for something more. Might we call it a holy longing? Okay, I was hoping somebody would get that. I know at least one person got it in here. Encounter with charism comes next, or the gift, and then as the gift of the Spirit is embodied in an order's or an institution's founding rule and its followers, and offers an essential point of contemplative grounding and contact to help bring the meaning of the vocation into greater focus and order. Ministry is then the outward expression and manifestation of the movement from vocation to charism into service. Okay, so I will pause there. One of the challenges of putting together this talk was not necessarily knowing what you know, not having been part of the Mazenodian Congress or family. And so part of what I was seeking to do in that first part was to consider this idea of an oblate or oblation as a kind of a broad movement within the church under which the Oblates of Immaculate Mary, with which you are familiar, or the Benedictine Oblates, are particular forms of that expression, and seeing how that has played out in the life of the church. So in following that history, I've kind of outlined this threefold pattern of oblation that corresponds with responding to a vocation or a call, receiving a charism, in this case through the particular charism of an order, and then bearing fruit in ministry as a form of witness to the gospel. So my goal in this second part, and I may need to skip a little bit for time, so bear with me, is to place this oblate theology into dialogue with more current trends in ministry. And I think that this will resonate with some of the questions about the structures and processes by which you are seeking to organize yourselves around the Mazenodian charism as oblate associates, if I believe that's the term you're using, correct? Yeah. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to claim that your existence, our existence as oblates in the church, makes them iconoclasts with this historically sticky distinction between lay and clergy, and trailblazers into emerging forms of ministry, which are seeking expression. And again, I think many of the questions in that first round were questions about how do we do this as trailblazers. The church historian Yaroslav Pelikan once noted that after each ecumenical council, of which Vatican II is the 21st, it's taken approximately 100 years for the people to live into the new doctrines, the new vision, and the movements of the Spirit that prompted and moved in and through the council itself. So, given that the Second Vatican Council closed in 1965, we're halfway through that process. I think we might find that perspective somewhat heartening as we wrestle with the meaning of the theologies of oblation that we're talking about tonight, in light of our attempts as Catholic Christians to live into a more adequate theological vision of the gospel that was articulated at the council. So despite all of the ongoing divisions and disagreements within the church, most would agree that Vatican II marks a decisive shift in a Catholic self-understanding of the church. Shortly after the close of the council, Pope Paul VI said, quote, "At the council, the church is looking for itself." So the question about who are we as Oblate associates looking for, how are we to be organized, I think is an extension of those questions. So we're living amid some of the deepest and most complex ecclesiological questions that the church has faced probably since the period of the early Christological debates and the patristic period. So, Wilhelm Hunermann, a German theologian, wrote that Vatican II is one of the most significant events in, quote, transformations among the people of God in the unfolding of their consciousness of having come of age. So the questions that we're wrestling with are questions of a people coming of age and of self-awareness of ourselves as a truly global church in a complex, modern, and increasingly secular world. So from about the 14th to the early 20th centuries, theologians viewed the church primarily through this institutional juridical lens. It was an institution intended to serve a kind of mystical purpose, leading the people beyond the sufferings of this world. In this system, the ordained clergy were the leaders and the ministers within this hierarchy, and which existed in order to dispense grace to a much more inactive or receptive lay faithful via the sacraments. As Thomas O'Meara describes it, he describes this Baroque theology, quote, "It made the Catholic Church appear as a pumping station at the center of an extensive waterworks of grace." Kind of an interesting metaphor to think about. So grace, in this view, rather than being a fountain of divine gratuity from which ministry flows, was rather kind of an insurance policy against the degrading effects of having to live in a sinful body and a depraved world. Some of you might be familiar with this French term that was used to describe the theology that was infused into the council, ressourcement. And this term, ressourcement, translates roughly to a return to the sources, to a critical and historically conscious reading of Scripture and the earliest writings of the church. So applying this ressourcement approach inspired the Council Fathers and the theologians they brought with them to notice that in the earliest centuries of the church, the focus was on the Spirit's expression in a plurality of ministries. And again, I think this fits for the image of the 8 expressions of the Mazenodian charism. The specific role of the priest and the juridical structure of the church was built up over time around a praying community in which a wide variety of circles of ministry emerged organically. The model of the church that the Council Fathers found in their ressourcement theology and that they sought to restore was an organic unity of the body of Christ. So in this unity, all the baptized members were called to exercise various functions of ministry, and each received the charisms or the gifts of the Spirit needed to carry this out. So the vision of Vatican II does not seek to eradicate things like holy orders, religious vows, canon law, institutions, or even hierarchy, but it does seek to restore a more proper order in which the juridical and the hierarchical emerge from and serve the Spirit rather than being used like a box to contain it or keep it from going too far. So in the period immediately leading up to Vatican II, the church had sort of become a reified object, a thing existing unto itself. One of the images that the Council Fathers used to work back towards a more organic unity of the body of Christ was the image of the church as the entire people of God. And this phrase, people of God, in fact, it's often put in caps, is emphasized in particular in chapter 2 of Lumen, Gentium, one of the 16 documents from Vatican II. So from this perspective, the church is the incarnated, the bodies gathering together in worship and liturgy, which the people give as their work in response to grace. Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead here, I think, so make sure we have time to finish what I want to say as well as have some questions. So the people of God form the church when they come together in sacrament, in worship, and in service to the triune God, to each other, and to the local and global community. So Christoph Theobald, another theologian, proclaims boldly that, quote, placing the future of Christian life and of the ecclesial community in the hands of the whole people of God, definitely this is the main aim of the council, end quote. Oblates, then, are one set of hands that constitute the people now called to hold and nurture that whole ecclesial community, the people of God. So the broad structure of this somewhat new vision of ministry and of the church can be seen in the structure of Lumen Gentium itself. The English title of this is the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, which is the document that has sort of become the focal point of most debates among theologians after the council. So I mentioned earlier that chapter 2 introduces the church as the entire people of God. Chapter 3 then discusses the visible or the hierarchical structure of the church as a means to support the organic unity or as something that emerges from it. And then chapters 4 through 6 describe the particular roles and ministries to which the baptized are called in service. So the specific calls to ordination or religious vows or even oblate vows or oblate associates or other forms of ministry are all placed in relief against this backdrop of the universal call to holiness that all baptized are called to. So distinctions might be emphasized or noted where necessary, but unity is emphasized. And this is the major thrust of this, what is now referred to as a communion ecclesiology that has emerged in the last 50 years or so. So there are, of course, other texts or dynamics within the council itself that we could reference in relation to a theology of oblation. I want to mention just 2 of those documents. And these are the Perfectae Caritates. The Latin title is the Decree on the Up-to-Date Renewal of Religious Life, and I have a hard time with this word, Apostolicam Actuositatem, the Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity. Now, neither document addresses Oblates directly. Perfectae, the Decree on the Up-to-Date Renewal of Religious Life, is actually a very short document. But it's significant because it called upon members of religious orders to revisit their founding charisms in order to renew their spiritual and apostolic lives. The decree on the apostolate of the laity begins by noting that the Holy Spirit is making the laity more aware of their active role in the church. Within that decree, you have kind of a dual emphasis of making the laity more aware of their role, while also kind of struggling to overcome this lay-clerical divide or dualism that I've mentioned. So the decree presents kind of a binary image of ministry in which the laity do their work by transforming the secular world, while the clergy exercise internal church authority. So on the one hand, in this text, the Council Fathers write that, quote, the characteristic of the lay state is a life led in the midst of the world and of secular affairs. On the other hand, they also write and encourage the laity, quote, to play their part in the mission of the whole people of God in the church and in the world. So notice here that in that quote, they're to play their part both in the church and in the world. So there's kind of a tension almost within the document itself. So how and where those outside of holy orders are to exercise this mission, in some cases remains unclear to many persons, including Oblate and Oblate associates, who clearly feel yourselves called to forms of ministry and leadership. But it would not be accurate to name what you're doing here as secular transformation of the world, right? It is ministry in the church directly and emerging out of the church. So it's worth actually noting as we consider these two documents that at the time these were written, the church had not yet seen a dramatic decrease in vocations, both to priesthood and religious life, that would come in the following decades. So from our vantage point, halfway through living into this new vision, recent increase in interest in oblation, as I've described it, and the different forms that could take, could be seen as a response to the two movements represented in these two decrees. So on the one hand, you have the return to the charismatic sources of the foundings of religious institutes. So here's where you are reconnecting with and excavating the Mazenodian charism. And paradoxically, this renewal is bearing fruit even as the numbers of professed religious continues to decline. So Thomas O'Meara writes, quote, the ministry, he takes this as a whole, ministry in the church, is both declining and expanding. It all depends on how you look at it. So again, how you look at it as Oblate associates looks like expansion and growth. Looks like it to me as well. So this Mazenodian Family Congress and the 8 expressions of Mazenodian spirituality might be seen as dynamic expressions of that renewal and expansion that is following both traditional and emerging patterns of religious life. So again, I think the questions we saw about this is how it's sort of been done traditionally by encounter through an order, but then there's other ways that have emerged and we're not sure where to place that, are expressions of that ambiguity. This growth among you all and say other oblates could be a concrete expression of that desire for mature self-awareness among the people of God that was intended by the Council Fathers themselves. So in a way that the Council Fathers could not have predicted, these two decrees have actually set forth two movements of the Spirit. a spirit of internal charismatic renewal that is also at the same time supporting external growth toward mature engagement in the life of the church by all baptized persons. So these dual movements, I think, are finding expression in a distinctive way in the lives of Oblates or Oblate associates. So even from the earliest days after the council, some prominent theologians took note of the uniqueness of this movement. So Karl Rahner, the famous Jesuit theologian, wrote an essay as early as 1955 on the subject of the lay apostolate. Yves Congar, a Dominican theologian, wrote in 1972, suggesting that, quote, that now, quote, the decisive coupling is no longer priesthood and laity, but rather ministries and modes of ministry, end quote. And O'Meara follows this by saying that ministry has moved from being a vocation for the few to being the gift and the work of many, a universal facet of baptized life. And he uses or offers this image of circles of ministry to describe this new movement of the Spirit. So in an overlapping network of circles of ministry, the baptized members of the body of Christ are called into participation in various times and in various ways. So this calling might manifest in short-term roles like serving as the board chair for a parish council or something like that, or sometimes in lifelong commitments that are recognized by orders, vows, or permanent roles. So viewed within these overlapping circles of ministry, Oblates and Oblate associates, as I understand it, often take a form of public vows or commitment to the Mazenodian Charism, just as I described kind of taking my Oblate vows in the crypt at the Abbey Church. And yet, it's not always immediately apparent how or where those public vows fall into specific ministerial categories, especially when we focus on that threefold division that I talked about before of bishop, priest, and deacon. So expressions of ministry have already expanded since Vatican II. As I'm sure you all know, a major one is the reinstitution of the permanent diaconate. There are new roles for pastoral administrators in parishes and dioceses, and leadership positions in Catholic healthcare, other social services, and in education. In particular, while Oblates are sort of living into some of these roles in particular ways, specifically when it comes to healthcare, education, and social service, it is also women religious who have also been some of the original trailblazers in these categories. They developed a kind of organic form of ecclesial authority simply by discerning the needs of their local community and responding to that call. And in doing so, they've built an astonishing network of some of the most robust social service institutions on the planet. And the Oblates of Mary Immaculate have done similar kinds of creating robust institutions. But interestingly, having forged these new paths, the numbers of directly vowed religious in many of these congregations are no longer sufficient to sustain the leadership that it takes to keep those institutions going. And this fact alone is leading to a need for new forms of professional leadership from persons who are required to possess theological education, at least to a certain degree, spiritual maturity, and professional competence in their fields. I see a lot of you shaking your heads because I think that's part of what you're all bringing together and wrestling with about how to do that and do it well. So I would hazard a guess that many of you in this room are in these kinds of professional ministries for which we don't yet have a fully adequate theology or terminology or obvious channels for recognition or how to structure that. So oblation or that's more my terminology coming from the Benedictine. Being an oblate associate, in your terminology, may be an emerging way that these roles are being recognized and supported through the charisms and the ministries that have historically been sustained in religious congregations. So in this sense, I mentioned before that oblates are sort of trailblazers, or oblate associates, what you all are doing. By responding to the promptings of the Spirit, by seeking to ground your spiritual lives and your professional commitments in this family charism, your vocation is supported, enhanced, and sustained. So we can see how oblation in the church today is both shaped by and in turn shaping these ministry trends that are emerging since Vatican II. And I would not want to predict or try to foreclose where the Spirit will lead into the 21st century, but I do want to conclude by offering 3 sets of questions or opportunities that arise from our discussion of this theology of oblation. So the first question has to do with the need for a more adequate theological language. The second question explores the challenge of lifelong faith formation for the baptized and considers how oblation might offer clues for doing this more effectively. And the third considers the emergence of new kinds of orders, for lack of a better term, or forms of consecration for those who serve in some of these expanding circles of ministry, such as those of you gathered here. So one of the greatest difficulties I found in preparing for this talk was trying to find ways of describing a ministry rooted in oblation without falling into a language that goes back into the lay clerical distinction. So on the one hand, I believe that we need to look for ways to move beyond phrases like lay leadership or lay apostolate. Even though I used it in the description of my talk, the more I did my research, the more uncomfortable I became with that language. Because in practice, as we've already noted, the term lay is inextricably linked with what it is not ordained, not priestly. And I should note that this is not meant to be a denigration of priestly ordination either, right? But simply seeking a more adequate language and theology to talk about these modes of ministry or circles of ministry. So one way I've kind of played with the language here is to occasionally go back to the original Greek term laos to refer to all the people of God, regardless of orders, vows, or status. Although even that I ultimately find rather unsatisfying. But at least points towards this distinctive manner in which post-Vatican II theology has worked to remind all the baptized that they participate in the one priesthood of Christ, along with the priesthood, kingship, and prophecy of Christ. How do we describe the way in which ordination toward ministry unfolds as an expression of the priestly office of Christ in which all baptized persons share? And how do we do that without denigrating the particular vocation to ordination to which priests are genuinely called, and without perpetuating a kind of second-class status for the laity or the non-ordained? And I have to admit, unfortunately, at this point, I can only seem to offer the question, and I don't yet see a clear way of resolving this linguistic theological challenge. But maybe that's something that can come out of ongoing conversations. Another clue might be found in noting that this post-conciliar approach to ministry, this is how O'Meara puts it. He says, nouns have become verbs. So I think that starts to also move us in the right direction toward a more adequate language. It recognizes that what we are after is not the right noun or the right category to place somebody into, but the right way of thinking about the active ministry that the Spirit calls us to. The Spirit is active and dynamic, and ministry reflects the ways that human persons respond to and then channel the always changing dynamisms of grace, or the charism that's given. Let's see here. I'm going to, for sake of time, skip ahead here again. So, we see what we're seeking is a more adequate theological language that will move us beyond a kind of hierarchically ordered dualism of roles, but which it focuses instead on the dynamics of grace at work in and through those who respond to the call of ministry. So perhaps our discussion begun here tonight, though not ended, will start to shed some more light on how to capture that. Capture's the wrong word. How to express it. My second question has to do with the need for ongoing formation for all baptized people of God. The decree on the laity that I mentioned before ends by noting that providing adequate formation for ministry is a particular challenge within a church where all the baptized are struggling to awaken to their full ministerial responsibility and potential. So I noted that in seeking association with a particular family charism, such as Mazenodian, Oblate associates are responding to an implicit need for spiritual depth in order to sustain a personal and professional commitment to ministry. My own experience in providing theological education to mission leaders in Catholic healthcare, and even offering workshops on theology, ethics, and spirituality within parishes, leads me to be a little bit more aware that for those who choose to remain in the church today, there's a deep hunger for ongoing spiritual formation that's grounded in good knowledge of history and in mature theology. So some persons might find their way into graduate programs preparing for ministry, but there are challenges with that as well, as many of you know, at a school of ministry. And yet many Catholics in the pews are hungry to understand Scripture, church history, liturgy, and moral theology at deeper levels. Oblate programs, or Oblate associate programs like yours, have found ways to provide ongoing, focused, and intentional formation to persons who wish to be associated with the congregation. So this is maybe a different way of asking some of the questions that were asked in the first half about how are you organizing yourselves. Conversely, might there be ways to extend the models that you're living out back into parish faith formation programs? Might pursuing such models also have an added benefit of providing more channels through which the Spirit might come to fruition through emerging forms of ministry? So it's kind of a both and. You're living out in response to a charism and wrestling with questions. The answers that you come to, I would also say, have something to offer back as a gift to the church, because you're finding ways to engage in that formation around the Mazenodian charism, while people in the pews are hungry for deeper formation. So there could be a both and happening there. Third and finally, I turn to a question about the public recognition of these new forms of ministry that you all are wrestling with, and consider what we might call sort of a consecration for ministry. So if post-conciliar theology emphasizes how baptism and confirmation are naturally ordered towards ministry, and as we're witnessing and expanding circles of ministry, even while the numbers of ordained priests and vowed religious are declining, then perhaps there are ways to publicly consecrate persons called to ministry in vocation-affirming ways. Such consecration would still remain distinct from ordination to priesthood, but could provide a ritualized and sacramental way of recognizing and empowering those who are called to either temporary or lifelong forms of ministry. The simple liturgy of professing my own oblate vows in the crypt of the Abbey Church has been a powerful reminder for me of the meaning and the challenge of being an oblate of St. Benedict. So my own experience of oblation and of training others for ministry, combined with tonight's reflection on what you all are doing as associates, leads me to consider ways that we might liturgically consecrate persons who are called and have been formed into ministry. To give credit where credit is due, I picked up this idea from something that Yves Congar wrote, who suggests that some ministries might include consecration while falling short of the full sacramental expression of ordination into holy orders. So, for example, are there ways to honor persons who go through a ministry formation experience that might include some training in theology or spiritual formation, but which might not extend to the depth of time or cost involved in a graduate degree or extending into full religious vows? These consecrations could provide a public recognition for those persons called to professions, say as theologians or mission leaders in Catholic social service agencies. This would highlight the value of these new circles of ministry, not only for those who are being consecrated, but by kind of shining a spotlight on them among the church itself, could point to the significance of ministry for all those who are baptized. In other words, it could be like a way of awakening all persons to the inklings of the Spirit that might be at work in the nooks and crannies of ministerial organizations or individual persons. And to circle back to my first point, this question about a space for some kind of public liturgical recognition is also tethered to the question of language that I noted above. That is, finding an adequate terminology and ritual to recognize in a public manner the ways that the Spirit is calling people into ministry helps to honor and sustain vocations and the institutions within which they're nurtured. So perhaps there are some liturgical insights that could be brought into the institutional questions that some of you are asking as well. Okay, so it's likely that over the next few days of this Congress and in your ongoing work to explore the meaning of the Mazenodian family charism in the world today, that you will find additional Spirit-infused answers to these questions about what is the vocation of the layperson in a charism that has come through a religious congregation. So let me express once again my gratitude for your invitation to explore this theology of oblation together with you this evening. It's my hope that some of the ideas that we've explored might provide some theological and historical food for thought as you continue to develop your own vocation, charism, and ministry as Oblates and Oblate Associates of Mary Immaculate. So thank you very much.